Have you ever wondered what the difference between a component team and a feature team is? Well, you've come to the right place. Let's start off with my customer who is requesting a button that does amazing things. Now, as a development company, I have exactly three ways of handling this. Let's look at method number one. Most development companies are organized in component teams. Here you can see a few component ideas. There might be teams that do payment, teams that handle database transactions, teams that are specifically dealing with middleware, for example. Each of these teams is really structured. They might have a manager who might have a senior manager and so on. And the whole company structure is based around these component teams. Now, as far as my customer requirement goes, how does that tie in with these teams? And you'll see that the first hurdle we come up is, can we identify which one of these teams will actually be needed to work on this particular feature A, let's say from our customer? And that's not so easy to tell. I mean, is middleware involved? Is business intelligence involved? We're not so sure. So companies like this will then start creating these positions or these roles called identifiers, whose purpose it is to actually identify which teams are actually going to be participating in the development of this feature A. So of course, these identifiers need to know the whole structure of the company, needs to know how they work. They're sometimes called architects, and they need to basically identify these teams. Now, once they've identified them, that's not the end of the story, because you can't just go and give this request A to each one of these teams and say, this is what the customer wants, go ahead and do it. So what they need to do is they need to create this position that I call breakdowners, which will break down the requirement from the customer into bits that actually make sense for the team. So for example, this bit here might make complete sense to the GUI team, and the GUI team can take this part of the requirements and actually go ahead and build it. And we can take this part and give it to the payment team, and that part and give it to the middleware team, and so on. I think you get my point. Now, once all these teams have done their work, we have then a problem of timing, because middleware, for example, might be extremely busy because they're busy doing things for all the other teams, so they don't have a lot of time. Whereas maybe the payment team, for the moment, this year, at this particular moment, they have a lot of time on their hands. So they might finish their bit quickly, and the middleware team might only be able to do their bit maybe a few months down the line, if we're lucky, or maybe a year down the line. And we don't want to do that because the customer is waiting for his for the thing that he's requesting. So we have created another position called these coordinators, which will then make sure that the teams are actually building their bits of the software at the right time so that it coincides with when other teams are actually building little pieces of the software. Now, once all this is done, you can imagine that the middleware has done their component, the payment team has done their bit, and so on. We need to know, do they all work together? Because, of course, they've done their testing inside their teams, but they're not really too sure of, does it work together? Basically, do the interfaces work? And this is where you get these integrators, or people that are specifically there to actually make sure that the different components are actually talking to each other properly. And then once that is done, we also have an idea of testing and quality assurance. We need to ensure that on a global perspective for this feature A, we can't just say that the individual teams, of course, the individual teams have taken care of their quality and of their testing, but overall, does the product give a quality feature to the customer in the end of the day? And that's really just considering that we have one feature, but obviously we have hundreds and hundreds of different features that the customers want. And every time we have a new feature, we have this whole process that starts again with people that have to identify which teams are involved, break down the thing into edible sections for each of the different component teams. We need coordination, we need integration, and we need some sort of quality assurance. In addition, you can imagine that the teams themselves are not entirely satisfied because they actually don't see what the customer wants to get. So they just see their part of the world and they don't actually see the big pictures, which makes them maybe a little bit more demotivated. So that's method one. Now let's go on to method two. Here we have a development company that is not yet ready to give up on its component teams. Maybe it has too much invested in the structure. Maybe the management layer is not willing to change, and so on. However, they do identify that all these extra roles and global testers and quality assurance and whatever, they do realize that this is inefficient. So they are more than willing to actually get rid of this, but they need to think of another way to make it all work. So instead of looking at the user requirement, or rather the customer requirement, they basically say that the customer requirement is not what they need to work with, and they rephrase or they redo the customer requirements into requirements that can be handled by the individual component teams. So what I mean is this component X, for example, is a component that can be independently built by the payment team. And the Y requirement is something that can be done by the middleware team, and the Z component might be able to be completely done by the graphic user interface team. So in a way, they've solved the problem by saying we now have requirements, or we now have a backlog of user stories that can be dealt with in an agile way by the payment team, because the payment team has no more any dependencies and so on. So as far as the developers are concerned, they're happy because they have no dependencies, they're doing agile, they can get on with the work they're doing, they understand what they need to do because they understand requirement X, Y, and Z perfectly. However, as far as the customers are concerned, and any roles that's really close to the customer, they have a lot of trouble. They don't understand these requirements perfectly because normally they're quite technical in nature. And they have a lot of trouble to be able to communicate that back to the customer, and be able to sell to the customer that something's happening and that they're getting something. The customer, remember, wanted a button that did these amazing things, but the product manager is not able to relate that back to the customer. All right, so that's method 2. So let's go on to method 3. Method 3 is where a development company is willing to break down their structure completely, to break down all these teams and create, you probably guessed it, feature teams. Now, if you look at the next animation here, you'll see that my component teams are all broken down and have become feature teams. And following the color scheme, you'll see that I've actually included every single color in each feature team. So a feature team is made up of different people coming from the original component teams. Now, how do we get to create these feature teams? Well, we have really two ways of doing it. One way is we ask the teams to organize themselves with the one and only condition, and that is that each team that they've made up themselves is capable of handling any customer requirement. So because they have all the different types of jobs in the job descriptions within this feature team, when a requirement comes in, like this requirement A, any of these feature teams can take this requirement and build it from start to finish. And that includes the testing, the everything, the integration, and all these things that we talked about before. The feature team is able to do it. And the result of that is that the developers are happy because, once again, they're completely independent. They're able to see the start to the end of the project. They understand their value to the customer. That's really important because then they see where they give value. And as far as the customer is concerned, they're thrilled because they are getting the amazing thing that they asked for in the first place and not something different. Okay, so I hope this video taught you something, and it's up to you now. Which method will work for you, do you think? Have a good day.